Hello everyone. Good night, good evening, or good morning. I'm David Yu, and I'm here to talk about some Crossfire strategies. So, first off, what is Crossfire? So, hopefully y'all know this, but Crossfire is a 3 minute kind of like speech, or I like to think of it as more of like shared time where both speakers from both teams get to ask each other questions. And the purpose of a Crossfire is to clarify, persuade, and kind of poke at weaknesses of your opponent's arguments. This speech or like this like time was originally modeled after Crossfire, which is literally a political debate show that used to air on CNN. Here in the image, you can kind of see this is a very heated debate going on. And a fun fact about public forum debate itself is that it was actually known as the Ted Turner debate, which is based on the CNN founder Ted Turner, who originally founded CNN. And as you can see here, crossfires can get very heated. That's another point I'll go on to address later, but it's important to stay calm, especially in front of lay judges and parent judges, because really they're your average parents and they don't want to see debaters just constantly fighting and like being very argumentative. So, some general crossfire strategies. Before a round or even a tournament, these are just some basics. You really want to understand your topic well, especially whatever side you're going to be arguing on, preferably both sides, because you'll be debating on both sides. And you want to know a lot of you want to have like a lot of factual evidence and like empirics, past examples, and also statistics work really well because especially in front of lay judges too, right? They want to see debaters who kind of know their stuff, and Crossfire is a great time for you to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. And like for instance, if somebody asked me a question about like I don't know, going back to like the microplastic or the plastics topic, they asked me something about like plastic contamination, and I gave them like a statistic mid Crossfire. It really makes me seem like I know a lot more than my opponents do, and that really can give you the upper hand, especially because not all the judges do this, but I do know some do vote off Crossfire. I've definitely lost a lot of rounds, or at least quite a few of them, to like bad Crossfire. So it's very important to pay attention to them, especially with lay judges. You also want to try to pre-prepare Crossfire questions to stock arguments. Now, I don't really recommend this, especially because it adds more time to like the preparation, to the amount of preparations you have to do. And the way it works is it's very similar to a block file where you have pre-written responses to other stock arguments, except in this case, you're basically pre-preparing crossfire questions to stock arguments. And what you want to do here is you want to look at some of the most common arguments on your opponent's side and think, what are the most common chains of reasoning here? And how could I exploit a certain like jump in logic and expose a weakness in their argument? Now, it's very general, and unlike block files, these really have to be fine-tuned to each specific round because like one of your opponents might be following one link chain while another one of your opponents might be following another. But in general, these can be pretty useful to like if you're going into a crossfire and you really don't know what to ask, you just have like a list of pre-prepared questions that are really strong. That's a great advantage for you, but it should not be your main focus when you're preparing. You should really be focusing on fine tuning your cases and making sure you have some block file prep done so that way like it kind of sets you up for success in rounds. And lastly, a good way to prepare yourself for questions that others may ask you is to read through your case, identify some like weaknesses, and basically strengthen the areas that you find are the weakest. So some like unrelated things that aren't like necessarily crossfire tuned, or you can um, or crossfire related, you can put spikes in your case, which are basically kind of like pieces of evidence or jargon that addresses these like potential responses without them even having been read. And you can also pre-prepare front lines and cards that like are meant to defend against any possible responses on your case. And additionally, for this, you can also ask anybody really, especially your partners, your teammates, like the other people on your debate team. You can also even ask people who know nothing about debate, like your friends or your family, because in my opinion, it's really advantageous to ask people like that because they're the average people who don't know that much about debate. So if they come up to you and they have a question about something that seems really obvious, chances are you're using way too much debate jargon and you want to make it understandable so that way your lay judges find your argument more convincing because they can actually know what's going on. And yeah, but overall, it's really good to just understand what you're talking about and what you're going to talk about, and kind of have like some light preparations on questions that you may ask and responses to questions that your opponents may ask. And then some during a crossfire speech, you always want to play it nice, especially with parent judges. But this isn't specific to parent judges. Really, no judges like it when you have like a pair of debaters or all of the debaters. You're like yelling, talking over each other. Like Crossfire is a very heated time because a lot of the times, right, you can get frustrated. Maybe they're avoiding your question. Maybe they're hogging speech time, but you don't want to make it seem like you're the bad guy because that just puts a lot of negative attention on you that can lower your speaks. It can really look bad, especially in front of lay and parent judges. That can really affect the outcome of a round. And so basically what you want to do really is if they're making any like flagrant violations, you don't want to like be really passive aggressive and hound them for it. You want to point it out in a way that makes it seem like they're doing wrong without necessarily becoming like the aggressive actor yourself. So try to avoid like talking loudly, raising your voice. Like, don't talk over your opponents. Try to seem really polite, like with the pleases and like just overall seem calm and chill, right? Because it basically makes you seem like you have more of a control over a situation than your opponents because your opponents are just like freaking out and they're like yelling at you. And you're like, dude, chill out, right? Like, not that deep. And then also, a lot of people call for evidence during cross. That's okay as long as you shouldn't be just asking, hey, can I have this piece of evidence, right? You want to be spending most of your time trying to clarify your opponent's position or weaken it. So typically, if you really want evidence, you can say like, can I just see that card after cross? Especially like if your opponents mention like, oh, we had this statistic actually that said XYZ. You say like, oh, can I see that card after cross, right? But generally, evidence can be called for during cross, but you really want to read through it after crossfire, and you don't want to be focusing all your questions on calling for evidence. And then cross-referencing crossfires, pun not intended here. You can do this during your speeches even too, especially if questions are unanswered, because just because something happens in crossfire doesn't mean it exists like in a bubble and doesn't like affect any of the rest of the round. Especially with tech judges, you might think like, oh, they're not really gonna like flow it. They're not some might not be paying attention to what's happening in your crossfire. But really it's a really powerful tool to look at what your opponents have done in crossfire and say, hey, look, they made this contradiction in cross, or hey, they said this, now they say that, right? Call them out for like violations in crossfire as well. You can maybe like run theory if you're really feeling like it, if they're like making super flagrant violations. But in general, crossfires don't exist in a bubble. So feel free to like mention anything your opponents do that could really become an advantage for yourself in later speeches or even later crossfires. Also, you do not want to give your opponents free speech time. Um, First of all, of course, they should not be hogging all 3 minutes. This is shared time. So if they're really going up there and they're asking you question after question, if you've answered it like sufficiently, you can say, okay, you've already been asking me questions for like X amount of minutes. This has been more than half of cross. Can I please just have a question, right? If they say no, I know it's very tempting to just say like, dude, that's so rude. Just say like, just be calm. That's the number one rule. You want to be calm because as soon as you get frustrated over it, it's really easy for you to seem like aggressive. You want to try to in these situations paint them as the aggressor without becoming the aggressor yourself. And really you want to ask smart questions. I'll go on to this later on, but you don't want to be asking them questions that basically allow them to elaborate on their speeches, especially if you don't know what questions to ask. And when you're asking questions, you want to try to set up traps for your opponents where they can like make contradictions, and especially you want to identify these contradictions and point them out to your judge. Basically, what you're doing, and you should be doing this throughout the debate, but you're trying to create a narrative where you make it seem like their side is advocating for something harmful, right? If they're saying, yeah, so, and then additionally, if you're having like trouble generating questions, my general tip is like you want to think what's the weakest point that they have or like the missing link in their arguments, and how can I use that to my advantage, and how can I transform that like advantage into a probing question, right? Because this last step is often one that a lot of debaters miss. They'll just go up there and they'll make a statement like you're missing your uniqueness, but that's not a question. And if I really had to answer that question, I could just completely avoid it by saying, "That's not a question. What's your question?" Right? Because Crossfire is ultimately a time to ask questions, not statements. So you don't actually have to respond to statements. And yeah. So how do you ask smart questions? So there's two key things you want to do. As I said in the last slide, you want to identify weaknesses or missing components in their arguments, right? So these include like logical gaps or leaps of faith in logic that aren't properly bridged, right? If your opponent gets from one point to another without actually explaining how or why, and if you're confused on it, chances are your judge is probably very confused as well. So you want to point that out and ask them how they get from one point to another. And you also want to be subtle but probing by asking them how or why questions. And by doing so, you can be creative. For instance, you can use analogies to help judges make connections to like real world concepts. Um, right? And then especially comparisons really help. Like I know it's kind of hard to contextualize questions as comparisons, but you can pose like what I've done in rounds before is I've posed a hypothetical scenario, compared it to what our opponent is advocating for, and say like, um, right, what would you do in this case? And then like maybe in a later speech, I draw back on this and say like, they said they do this, like that's innately harmful, or that's actually not what's happening with them. In fact, they're like contradicting themselves here, kind of. So that's like another example of a trap you'd set up. And there's a lot of don'ts here. You really don't want to make statements. These aren't questions, and if I had to deal with them, I just really literally just say, "That's not a question. What's your question?" Um, in a nice way, of course. But you want to avoid making statements. They're just waste of times, and they really don't get anything out of your opponents, and they just make you seem like you have no idea what you're doing. And additionally, there's a lot of people who instead of making statements, they ask like, "Do you agree?" questions. So basically, they make a statement and then they say, "Do you agree?" Personally, this is like the same exact thing as making a statement. You're not actually like asking them for your input because you already have like a predetermined opinion that affects your side. And to be honest, whenever somebody would ask me that question, you can just say no. Right? Because no, you don't agree, and you've just answered their question. Really, that's a waste of time for them. It also gives you the chance to reiterate your arguments. You can say like no because when they say like do you agree, you don't have to agree, right? You're not obliged to agree. And in fact, you shouldn't agree because you guys are, unless this is like a point you guys both agree on because it helps both of your cases. Um, really, there is really no purpose in these do you agree questions. If you want to make statements, save them for later speeches, and don't let them reiterate their arguments too much. A lot of debaters, like you ask them a question and they're gonna go on like a 1 minute and 30 second like speech about that encompasses like all their arguments. Really, you just ask one question about one thing, and you don't want them going on like this giant spiel about like where they get to reiterate their own arguments. So what I've seen a lot of debaters do and what I'm trying to implement right now is, right, if you ask a question, maybe follow it up by like summarize your argument in one sentence, or like keep it brief and concise. That way your opponent makes sure that they're not like going on for you make sure your opponents aren't going on forever and ever, and you get what you want while making sure that there's enough time if you want to like ask any more like probing questions in the future. And like a more nuanced concept is you don't want to reveal all your arguments for the next speech. Like especially these typically come in the form of statements, and you typically see these in like first cross, right? um it's like somebody ask a question that's literally the same thing as like a block or a refutation, and they ask like, "Do you agree?" Really, that just tells your opponents, "Hey, in the next speech, I'm about to run this argument," and then their second speaker can start prepping you guys out or prepping out front lines, and that's really disadvantageous for you because that's basically wasting your time because you're going up there and they've already pre-prepared responses to your responses. Um, and then another important aspect of crossfires is really answering the questions. So when you're answering questions, you want to be direct, concise, and confident. These are like the three key things you want, especially in front of lay judges, because to lay judges, they don't really understand the concepts as well. They're not really following the flow as well. Chances are they're not even taking notes. But if they have one pair of debaters who know what they're doing, who seem super confident, and then another pair of debaters who are always hesitant. They're like quieter. They kind of stumble on their words during crossfire. To them, the other team knows what they're doing, and that's key to them in their ballot decisions. Also, when you're answering questions, you want to use each question as an opportunity to elaborate on your own argument, right? Because that is a way you kind of basically manage your time more efficiently. You're maximizing your time so that way with every word you're saying, with every answer you're giving, you're always giving the judge another reason to vote for you. And of course, you should still be answering the opponent's question. Like if they ask something about your refutations, don't go on to case. But in general, you really want to use these as opportunities. So like bring the focus back to your arguments and some things you don't want to do when you're answering questions is seem hesitant or unsure. And you definitely do not want to make contradictions with what your partner has said, with what you've said, or like what with what you're going to say in later speeches, because that makes it seem like you have no idea what you're doing, and to judges that's really bad. Additionally, if you don't know how to answer a question, the first thing I recommend is checking to make sure that the question makes sense. Like if they're asking like a really weird question that doesn't make sense at all, ask for a clarification. Like that's okay if you don't understand the question, it's not the end of the world. Now if it's a super obvious question, like if it's direct, like do you have any quantifications on this, um unless you didn't hear them properly, don't ask for a clarification because that is kind of that could be perceived as like stalling. But if you genuinely didn't hear what they said, you can always ask for like a clarification. And if it doesn't make sense, chances are again if it doesn't make sense to you, like a seasoned debater who's been doing debate, it probably doesn't make any sense to like a judge who probably won't understand as much as you do in terms of debate and the topics you're debating about. And sometimes you can get away with giving a vague answer. Sometimes your opponents will punish you for doing that, but really, if you give a vague answer that's still like supporting your own arguments, you can kind of get away with you kind of answer the question without like directly answering it. But don't do this too much. It's kind of abusive. And really, if your opponents pick up on that and they point that out and you still don't know how to answer the question, it makes you seem like you're just stalling for time and wasting their time, which is also very bad. It's like a bad look for you. And lastly, if you don't have an answer, if you genuinely don't have an answer and can't think of like a vague answer, just say you don't have an answer, but don't just leave it there. You want to justify why you don't have an answer. And you don't want to be like, oh, I don't have an answer because like I don't know what's going on. You want it to be like, oh, I don't have an answer because that's totally unreasonable of you to ask for me. Like, how am I supposed to know exactly what fossil fuel levels will be at by like 2100 or like 2000 the year 2200. Now of course your opponents aren't going to ask that far in the future, and ideally prediction statistics do exist, but sometimes your opponents will ask you like really silly things like um for instance like how do nuclear reactors create like nuclear energy. And let's say I don't know how nuclear reactors work, I could just say, dude, I'm not like a nuclear physicist, but of course nicely. But however, they do make energy. And then you can also ask your partner, or you can even do some like quick Google searches really. But if it's like common sense, if it's common sense, like right? Nuclear reactors make energy via nuclear fission or something like that. You don't want to like say, yes, I do exactly know, and then like not. know it, especially because if you provide false answers and your opponents know you provided false answers and they pick up on that, um, you're basically framing yourself as like an unethical debater, and your judges won't trust you as much. This is kind of similar to having good evidence ethics. So you want to make sure what you're saying is true, and if you don't know it, um, explain why you don't have an answer, and try to not make it seem like you don't have an answer because you have no idea what's going on. Make it seem like it's kind of their fault. But then again, don't do that if it's like if you don't know it, just admit it, really. There's no point in like going on to lie about it. But ideally, what I go for here is I just give a vague answer. And then so speech specific. During first Crossfire, this is after constructive and includes the first speakers of both teams. A lot of the times you're going to be asking clarifications on their case, right? If they had one link that really didn't make sense, or if they're making too many jumps, ask. If they were like talking, general rule of thumb, if you couldn't understand what they were saying because they were talking too fast, or they weren't being like clear or enunciating on any like when they were speaking, and you truly didn't like catch what they were saying, you can always ask for clarifications, and especially if your opponents are spreading and they don't give you speed stock. But also, you want to ask like a mix of clarifications and probing questions on specific components of their case. And what you try to do in these probing questions is you're trying to test for solvency. So, for instance, you can ask causality questions. Why or how does X lead to Y? Especially if you have a certain case that proves otherwise, you can kind of bait them into like giving you an answer and then saying like, actually, no, we find otherwise, but you can have a question, right? Um, and then also, so a lot of the times your opponents will end up getting like far-fetched numbers, right? So it's really good to ask them, how do you get your numbers, right? Of course, not like where did you get your numbers from, because they're just gonna say like I got it from, and then they're gonna name like the source. But more specifically, like the internal links with the links within their impact that they get from like the internal link to the impact. And you really want to probe at, are their like numbers global? Are they topic specific? And if not, you can point that out to the judge. And that's really advantageous for later speeches because you can like continue to mitigate their impacts. But in general, you should be targeting the uniqueness, the links, and the impacts and gaps between them, right? And yeah, for second crossfire, this occurs after rebuttal and includes the second speakers of both teams. This is the time where you ask clarifications on refutations or front lines for the second rebuttal if they gave one, or if they gave any, which they should be, hopefully. And when you're asking probing questions, these should be focused on like the logic behind each refutation or front line. And especially you want to be looking at the implications of each response. The questions you ask here are similar to the questions you make on case, except they're a bit more fine-tuned to like what's happened overall. So you really want to look for contradictions, especially within the responses and their case, and offense versus defense, right? If they read a turn and a D link, or if they read like an impact turn and a link turn, you can point that out in a question form, or you can basically ask them like, "What's your response?" Because you're kind of not clear on whether your position is this or that. That's erring more on the side of like a statement, but you can generally use these because you're kind of clarifying what their final stance is while subtly pointing out that they have contradictions. So that's useful. And also, like if they make a response and they say like X leads to Y, and then in their case they say like X doesn't lead to Y. That's obviously a big thing you should point out and make sure that your judge is aware of that, and at the same time you know what your opponent's going for. And some examples of like questions you'd give are again, why and how does X lead to Y, especially when you're responding to refutations and front lines. And the next two examples are also applicable in any crossfires really, but why must we negate or affirm if like X is already happening? This is basically a non-unique, and it's kind of it's kind of more for the negative because it basically says that we're already solving for the affirmative's problems. but you want to really be careful with these types of questions because um this is kind of like a statement question. Again, it's like not like it's more multifaceted, as in they can't just say yes, I agree with you or no, I disagree with you. They kind of have to explain their link chain, but again, you don't want to let them advocate for their own arguments. Now, if you genuinely don't understand what's going on, please ask them clarifying questions. But if you don't know what to ask, don't give them chances to talk about their own arguments, unless you're trying to poke at them. And another example is like, why can't we continue to do this? Or why are your impacts unique to your scenario and not others? These can be used by Denag. They're basically the same as the previous example, just phrased differently. These are also non-uniques. Um, though, especially I see the second type more common of like, why are your impacts unique to your scenario? Because a lot of the times debaters will contextualize one problem to like solving the entirety of climate change, right? There are some arguments in pretty much every single topic saying this is going to be the main cause of climate change or that's going to be the main cause of climate change, and then in their impacts they're going to branch out to like global extinction, or like 1/6 of the global population dies after like a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and really that's not entirely caused by the specific problems they mentioned. It's actually like a multitude of factors. So you want to make sure that their impacts are specific to their scenarios and not like more generalized impacts, because if you really don't contest that, they just get access to big numbers that like really make no sense. And if you don't point out on it, like if you don't point it out, nobody will know. So it's good to point them out. And then lastly, in Grand Crossfire, this is the speech after summary, and it includes both speakers from both teams. Here you want to clarify which arguments are being collapsed on, especially if your opponents are being very vague about it. If they didn't collapse on any arguments, or if they go for both, you have your answer there. But if they kind of like only talk about one argument and then they like don't talk about the other at all, but at the same time they didn't say like I'm focusing or I'm collapsing on this argument, you can make sure you're clarifying on that to make sure that in your final focus you're not going to like write a speech on one argument and then figure out they collapsed on another. That would be really bad. And then you can also clarify on the weighing, especially if their weighing doesn't make sense. Um, and you also want to ask probing questions to make weaknesses in their arguments and more clear to the judge, because at this point it's really like the final, almost the final say in the round. It's right before the final focus, which is the last opportunity for each team to make their last arguments to the judges, and you want to focus on weak arguments. Oh, yeah. This also does apply to LD. I haven't done too much LD, but I believe it is quite similar. Um yeah, in general, though, one thing to note about Lincoln Douglas is that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but crossfires are only like one side asking another side. So inherently, they become slightly more civil. And really, you can't avoid questions by asking questions. That's a big thing a lot of PF debaters do. Like, you ask them a question, they're going to be like, well, you don't explain this, so why does this happen to this? And then all of a sudden it's like you just ask a question, it's your responsibility to answer it. Like that's a bit of nonsensical. But in LD the general strategies for asking and answering the questions still remain the same. But I guess the speeches would be like this, the speech and time allocations would be a bit different. And also, you remove the aspect of like one side asking questions. It's just one side asking another side questions. So, um, typically I think from what I'm assuming, they are less chaotic, and hopefully you can't really accuse the other side of like hogging speech time because it's literally all allocated to them. So I guess that kind of makes it slightly calmer, considering you can't necessarily compete for question answering time. However, they still can get very heated, right? Let's say you're asking someone a question and they don't really answer it, and you continue asking them the question because they're not answering it, and then they continue to give you the vaguest responses ever. You could get a bit frustrated, but it's still important to remember to stay calm and don't make yourself seem like the bad guy in that case. Like don't be like over aggressive or rude. And Yeah, but in general, I know in the past few slides, I've talked about specific PF speeches, though I'm sure this can definitely be applied to Crossfire minus or Lincoln Douglas minus the aspect of like the Grand Crossfire. And yeah, so going back to the Grand Crossfires, um you really want to focus on weak arguments because at this point in the round, there's no point in making new arguments in Crossfire because you don't really get to do anything with them in Final Focus unless you're planning on like trying to discreetly introduce new arguments in front of a lay judge, which you might be able to get away with, but it'll be risky in first rebuttal. Second rebuttal, you can probably get away with it, but um, so you really want to focus on weak arguments and continue to ask them how and why questions that weren't addressed earlier. So if they were avoiding a question, or if they really just weren't, or if you never really had time to get to a question, you want to take this time to ask those questions to make sure like you have some additional information. And lastly, I mean, it might seem like Grand Crossfire is really pointless because, right, you can't really make any new arguments in final. It's basically like if you ended up calling for like a card right before your final focus. It seems like there's really no point in it. But to a judge that's watching the round, especially like a lay judge, right? If they see that you have the advantage in this crossfire, it gives them a better impression, especially because it's so much later in the round. It makes you seem like at the end of the round, you're the one who knows what you're doing. So you really want to make sure you continue to expose their weaknesses in this speech. Should the second speaker try using Grand Cross as prep time for them? Um, I would say the second speaker, I'm a second speaker, so in some of my rounds I've had speaks docked because um I was just sitting there and letting my partner handle cross, which is it's a great strategy for like saving time to prep, but at the same time, especially in front of lay judges, it makes you seem like you don't know what you're doing and that affects your individual speaks. And it's quite noticeable. Judges notice it and you'll lose a lot of speaks for it, or not a lot, but you'll still lose speaks. And so I recommend kind of like popping in, asking a question or two, but you really want to kind of like pull back and let your partner do most of the heavy lifting. But ideally, you should be participating at least like for a quarter or a third of the Grand Crossfire. Oh, is cross flowed? Um, Typically no. For both lay judges and tech judges, lay judges don't really. Most lay judges don't really flow anything. So but they do actually pay a lot of attention to Crossfire. In fact, some lay judges just pay attention to Crossfire and vote on Crossfire. Though maybe they do. But they do take crossfires into accounts. I've had crossfires pop up in numerous RFDs. So you want to make sure that what you're doing in crossfire, you're like you present that like you know what you're doing and you present that you're confident. And for tech judges, they don't flow crossfires necessarily. At least I'm not aware of any tech judges who flow crossfire. But in general, same goes for tech judges. They're still probably going to be paying a decent amount of attention to what's going on in cross, what the dynamic is, and how you're really taking on how you're answering questions and how they're answering questions to kind of like determine who knows what and like what's going on in the round. And also, an important point I'd like to mention is that a lot of debaters think that like cross isn't flowed, so basically they don't really have to like it exists in like a bubble, so they don't really have to like it's kind of separate from the other speeches, but really it's great to cross-reference your crossfires in later speeches in later crossfires, right? Say like, oh, our opponents say this in cross, but then they say this in like their next speech. This is a contradiction. Or maybe they make like a faulty response, like they say something about in crossfire that isn't necessarily true. And like in crossfire, if they say something that's not true, you can contest it, but you don't want to like go back and forth arguing with them. I see this a lot too, where it's like one person asks something and then another person answers it, and like the other person's like, no, that's not true. And then there's like it's just a lot of statements that are being thrown around, but not any questions. And this is a great time to ask questions, but not really make statements. So really be careful with that. And Yeah, speaking of Grand Cross, that reminds me of another thing. Partner coordination. It's really important to coordinate with your partner, especially in in-person tournaments when you guys are sitting right next to each other. It's a lot easier because if you're in Crossfire and your partner and you are trying to like if your partner and you are like talking over each other, that seems extra bad because you guys seem like an uncoordinated like pair of people who've like never known each other, just like talking over each other. And you want to try to organize your responses, right? So if your partner is going to ask a question, right, give them the question. If your partner makes a response that you don't like, don't argue with them because they're not your opponents at the end of the day. Just make sure you really present to the judges that you guys are a team because being a cohesive team really makes you guys seem more professional and like you guys know what you're doing. And at the same time, it's also really great because you don't want to be making contradictions with your own partner. I actually ended up losing a round because um, in Georgetown, I think it was we were 5-0. We were feeling really good. There was this one round we were winning pretty well on the flow. And then in Crossfire, they asked for a card, and I gave my opponents one card, and my partner gave my opponents another card, and it was a mess. They pointed that out, and we had trouble kind of getting back from that, and that's why we lost the round because the judge said we presented two pieces of evidence. They didn't know which one to choose. Um, but in general, what I recommend is trying to create like a secret code with your partner, not necessarily secret, but for instance, what I do with my partner is I like to make like subtle taps on my desk or like the desk to make sure that they know that I'm going to either be taking a question or making a response. And if you're online, you really want to, you can't really do this. So what I recommend is kind of like taking a pause or even asking your partner, "Hey, do you want to take this question?" Or like, "I'll take it," you know? It makes you guys seem like you guys are being respectful to each other, and at the same time, you guys are coordinating without necessarily having these like secret signals. So if I was going up to take a question, or especially mainly for responses, or sometimes I just alternate questions with my partner. And if I'm going to take a question, I say, "Do you have any questions or should I go?" Right? Um, or not with it, or should I go? Like, do you have any questions? Right? And additionally, for responses, I'll say, like, "Oh, I'll take this one," or "Do you want to take this one?" That doesn't necessarily mean that I don't know how to respond. That just kind of means that I'm giving my partner an opportunity to chip in perhaps. And some judges may take it as like a sign like, "Oh, I'm trying to avoid the question." So generally be careful when you're doing that, but yeah, it's really good to coordinate with your partner. um I do pre-write questions for cross only when I have a lot of time to prep, and especially if I'm feeling really comfortable with my case and my block files, I'll typically pre-write questions for crossfire. And the way I do those is they kind of function very similarly to block files, as in um, you take you take a very common argument on the opposing side. You look at the specific links that are the most common, and you think, what are these logical gaps that my opponents might be making in order to get from one point to the next? And based on those, you can create crossfire questions. You can also, if you do a lot of practice rounds, you can observe like a lot of the times my opponents are missing these arguments, or when I ask this question, it's really hard for them to answer it. So just make sure you keep a mental note of that and maybe write it down. But in general, I highly recommend if you're low on time and if your cases and block files aren't in the best condition, you should really be focusing on those because at the end of the day, um, especially in front of tech judges, it's not the end of the world if you don't know what to ask, but it really is the end of the world if you don't know how to respond to a refutation, or not the end of the world, but you're more likely to lose a round if you don't know how to respond to a case or defend your own case or even like have a case than if you like didn't know what to ask in Crossfire. And generally, you can ask like really vague questions in Cross as well. If you're really stuck, you can ask clarifying questions like they're kind of poking around at your opponents, but really they're kind of just like tests to make sure they understand what's going on. In general, like um they're not too big of a deal, but especially for if you really are committed to like seeing success. Now, sometimes you might just naturally be better at asking questions, but it's really advantageous to pre-write questions for cross, yeah. And with that, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all for coming. If you guys have any questions, um, actually, do you guys have any questions?
Can I ask a question? So pretty much I was wondering, like during rounds, sometimes my opponents, like during cross, they ask something on their case, for example, like for this topic, right? Encryption.
Hmm.
Like if they're running human trafficking on NAF and I'm neg, they ask me like, so do you believe that we should not stop anything on human trafficking? Like that's where I get confused. What would you recommend?
Yeah, so here, if their questions don't make sense, oh, sorry. If their questions don't make sense, what you want to do is you want to ask them like you want to ask them like a clarifying question like, um, can you please restate your question or reword your question? Because chances are, if it doesn't make sense to your judge, it probably, or if it doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense to your judge either. That's like a really big rule of thumb. So, if you really don't know what's going on, that's not really on you. Sometimes it's just like they just asked a really wordy question. Um, but in general, here it is. If they're making statements or do you agree or do you believe questions, um, you don't want to say yes because they're just asking you, hey, do you agree with my arguments? And if you say yes, that makes you look really bad. If they are asking a question that seems like in this case, right, encryption, they're asking about human trafficking. If they ask, do you believe this? You can say no, but if you don't have like an exact response to what they're saying, just reiterate your own arguments, right? Let's say you're running like privacy on the neg, you say like they say, do you believe this? You say no, in fact, and then like maybe you run like a mini turn, I guess. You could actually do that. I think with privacy, you can say like, with as encryption decreases, um, like users are like less secure and more prone to like cyber attacks, which leads to like more human trafficking. Of course, that's not exactly how it goes, but you can definitely probably tie it back to like a turn. But you never want to say yes to these questions unless this is common ground that both your opponents and you agree with. Um, and the only common ground you guys should really have is if you guys are relying on the same links to make different arguments. Like, do you agree that like plastic production will decrease after like the US bans single-use plastics, right? Both sides are probably going to be relying on this link, so you should say yes. And that's like really a silly question for them to make, but you're not obliged to say yes and say no. And if you don't know why, like how to justify it, you can just say no. Like you can say no. If they ask you why, you can come up with a like a relatively vague answer, or you could like make a turn, reiterate your arguments. But general rule of thumb, just say no. And then you can justify it as well. But I actually you should justify it, but don't say yes. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay, sounds great. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Wait, so if our opponents ask like, do you agree with this? Do we just say no?
Yeah, basically. Because fundamentally they're basically asking, do you agree with our side? And like if they're asking um do you agree that human trafficking is like, well, if they say, do you agree that human trafficking is bad? You can probably say yes. I wouldn't say no in that case. That would put you in a pretty tricky situation unless you're running an impact turn in front of a tech judge. But um in general, if they're asking you to agree with the logical jumps in their case, you want to say no. And you either all offer your alternative jump or you just explain why theirs doesn't make sense. But if they're asking you things that aren't related to logical jumps, like do you agree that human trafficking is bad? You might interpret this as them saying like, "Oh, do you support our human trafficking AF?" But you can say yes while still maintaining your position. you want to be cautious. You want to say yes, but because if you just say yes, I agree that human trafficking is bad, your opponents will probably go up in the next speech and they'll be like, our opponents made a huge concession. They said human trafficking is bad, and in fact, we end up stopping human trafficking. They want you to vote for us, right? All that nonsense. But if you say yes, however, your side doesn't actually stop human trafficking because XYZ, you're making it clear that you, of course, agree that human trafficking is bad, right? That's pretty logical, a pretty moral and logical deduction for you to make. However, you don't agree with their specific link chain, and you don't agree that the app has anything to do with solving human trafficking. And that's how you get away with like kind of dealing with these do you agree questions. And they're very common. Um if a lot of not all the times, but a lot of the times your opponents will end up asking like, do you agree that this leads to that, right? And if it's something that if you agree with, you're basically conceding to like their entire case, just say no and just like read like a quick response or a refutation if they're really asking, if they're really pressing you for a justification. But in general, you don't have to agree with everything they say. If it makes sense to agree and if it doesn't harm you, go for it. And if you think it might harm you, make sure you reiterate why you said yes. Like if they ask me, human trafficking is bad, I say, well, yeah, human trafficking is bad. However, my position solves for human trafficking better than yours. Like, and then I read a turn, or your position doesn't actually solve for human trafficking because XYZ. And this way, you're just maintaining your position and also not like seeming like a human rights offender or something like that. Oh, if they ask a really dumb, non-topical question, just ask them like, how does that have a, for instance, if they said like on the encryption topic, like, how do single-use plastics affect encryption? I'm like, they don't, right? Sometimes you don't have to explain things if they don't make sense. Just like, no, right? A lot of debaters overlook this, right? If they get like, do you agree questions, they'll be like, oh, well. I think this, but like actually just say no, right? Or yes. But however, like you guys don't actually lead your chain of reasoning isn't actually this. And um if they're stalling for time, well, you don't typically point out that they're stalling for time, even if it's very obvious, because it really doesn't help you in any other way, and it kind of makes you seem like passive aggressive. Um, but if they're asking a non-topical question, you can ask them a question about for the first thing I do is I'd ask them like, how does this have any relevance to what we're debating about? And they if they give you a justification, then go ahead and answer the question. If they don't give you a justification, if they're like, dude, just answer my question. Um, if they give you a silly question, just give them a silly answer. Actually, make sure you're not seeming passive aggressive and like really toxic by firing back. But if they're asking you like something super non-topical, you say, well, no, this has no relevance to the topic. Or, well, I don't know because I came here to debate about like encryption, right? Um, Oh, but in general, please don't say it like that. That's not a great example. Try to keep it like try to keep the like sarcasm and like passive aggressive nonsense to a minimum. Stay calm, because remember your judges don't want a room full of four debaters who are high schoolers bickering around and like just being rude. So if you present yourself as a side that's nicer, you get an inherent advantage. Oh, if they keep skirting around a question, should I ask them to just say yes or no? Um, it does depend on what question you're asking, because if you're asking a why or how question, typically they can be answered by yes or no's. But if they're skirting around a question, you should really press them for it. You should be like, "Hey, can you please answer my question in like a can you can you please answer my question?" And if they make some like vague response that has nothing to do with what you've asked, which is what a lot of debaters will do, a wise thing to do would be like, you didn't really answer my question, and then you can continue pressing them. And if it's been a long enough time where you've just been pressing them for this question and they haven't really answered it, and let's say it's like a minute 30, you've been asking the same question, they never responded to it. And if you have a lay judge, you can I highly recommend not continuing to press it. Um, and if they end up pointing out like, hey, it's been a minute 30, can I please have a question, right? Of course you don't want to say no, you can't have a question, right? Like answer mine first. But you also want to make it clear to the judge, they didn't answer my question. I'm not just gonna give up. So you can say something like, okay, you can have a question now, but like okay, you didn't respond to my question, but you can have a question now, right? You're not like necessarily being rude about it, you're just kind of pointing out like you didn't respond to my question, but sure, you can have a question, right? um if I ask about a card and they spend a whole minute pulling it up, what should I do? Oh no, don't apologize for the question, they're great, yeah. um yeah, this is a really important part, especially in crossfires. You don't want to be spending time pulling cards up. I mean, if you're stalling, maybe you should, but you ideally you shouldn't even have to stall. You should always be asking questions or answering them. If you ask for a card, so here I would advise two things. One, call for cards after or before cross. Never call for them during cross, especially don't ask for the specific card. Um, don't ask for the specific card during crossfire. Like you can say like, oh, if they make a if they answer your question with like a statistic or they make like a really kind of sketchy claim, you say like, do you guys have a card on that? They say like, yeah, we do. And then you're like, okay, can we see that card after cross? And then they're like, sure. Or if you really want it during cross, you can say, hey, can I have like the card? And they say, sure thing. But the first speaker should not be pulling up that card. The second speaker should be doing it. Um, if they're taking forever to like pull up the card, you can say like, do you want a question, right? And then if they're like, yo, I'm trying to pull up the card, I'm like saying, you can just basically say, you can have your second speaker do that, right? Because ideally your second speaker should be decently, or depending on what speech it is, but the other speaker should ideally be tuned into what's happening, and they should be the ones providing for the card, not your opponents. You This is the time for you guys to ask questions. So like if they're really kind of pushing it, you can you can kind of just say like, okay, I'll have the card after cross, right? Let's go back to asking questions now. Of course, don't say the last part. Just say like, oh, can I have a question, or do you want to take a question, right? Kind of transition back into crossfire, but don't spend all your time during crossfires pulling up a card. And also, if they're spending a whole minute to pull a card up, it looks really sketchy to all judges, no matter like what time it is. So like in general, if you're dealing with people who are like taking obnoxiously long to like pull up a card, sometimes you can ask like, you guys have already spent like 3 minutes trying to get this card. Do you guys have it? Or like it's fine if you guys don't, right? Yeah, you can do that. And also um if they're you really want to make sure they're not stealing prep. So what stealing prep is basically like they're like, you ask for a card, they're like okay, and then one of their speakers actually goes to find the card, and the other one's like basically prepping for like their next speech, right? Um Typically it's kind of obvious if you're taking obnoxiously forever, and especially in person, it's really easy to see if you're stealing prep. So like if you're writing stuff down, if you're typing, so make sure like you're not stealing prep, and make sure your opponents are not stealing prep. Especially if you're the one who's pulling up the card, make sure your opponents aren't like stealing prep, and like while they're waiting for the card, they're prepping out, because they shouldn't be. And if they are, you can say like, um, unmute your mic and say, are you guys prepping? Because if so, you guys can take prep time now, right? Um, Kind of just like subtly pointing out that like, oh, they're taking prep, like they should stop stealing prep time. And if they spoke first, should we just let them have the first question? um in general, yes. If I was doing it, I would try to make it as in like I'm the nice one. So I'd be like, you guys spoke first, so you guys can have the first question, right? And that way it's kind of like I'm letting them have the first question. How nice of me, right? And similarly, if I'm trying to get the first question and the other guy is like the second speaker, I'd say, since we spoke first, may we please have the first question? And if they say no, don't argue with them. It's nonsense, but it kind of like shows to your judge like, that's kind of like a weird thing to deny considering they have a good reason to like ask the first question because they went first. And so yeah, it obviously raises alarm bells for your judge, and they're probably going to like view you guys more favorably. Um, yeah. Will your judge think worse of you if your follow opponents ask if they can have a follow up and you just say no? It really depends on the context. If they are spamming follow ups, like they're like follow up, follow up, follow up, and these have like no relevance to the original question, if they're not asking like a clarification on your answer, or ideally they shouldn't really be having follow-ups. Now, if they just ask a question and you give an answer and they ask for a follow-up, you should give it to them. But especially you should be monitoring the time. If their follow-ups, consecutive follow-ups take like more than a minute 30, that's kind of like you can say, um, don't just flat out say no, but just say, it's already been judge, it's already been a minute and 30 seconds. Maybe please take the question and don't necessarily address the judge because you don't want to encourage judge intervention, but maybe address your opponents. But in general, you don't have to let them take follow up after follow up. If they're being abusive about it, just point it out and try to get another question. Um, yeah, but in general, I don't think they'll think worse of you, especially if you give a good reason for why you're denying the follow up. Um, if they've been hogging time, if they've been taking up so much time and you haven't had a chance to answer a question, that's a valid reason to say no, right? Because they've just taken up all your time. And now, if you ask for a question and you give them a good reason, which is like a minute and 30 seconds of like me asking a question, they don't really have any valid reasons for why they would continue to press on a question. And if they say no to you there, that makes them look bad. There is one kind of thing that I'd caution you guys against, which is sometimes one person asks a question, another person gives a response, and then the other person asks the same exact question over and over again, and the person who's being asked the question continues to answer it. But the issue here is that what one side will say is, dude, I've been asking you this question and you've never really responded to it. May you please just respond to our question? And then the other guy's like, well, you've been taking up a minute and 30. May I please have a question? So these are both valid reasons to continue asking questions, which is they didn't respond. And or like you've been like taking up a lot of time, like I should have a question now. Um, but if you're in one of those situations, you want to be very careful here because you want it you don't want to argue with them over these silly little things of like, oh, you didn't answer my question versus, oh, you're taking up all my time, because those typically turn out to be like they may cross very heated because both sides feel like it's not fair to them. But what I would recommend here is whatever side you're taking, whether you believe that they've been hogging time or that they haven't answered your question, you can just like lightly point it out. You say like, you haven't answered my question, or you haven't you've been taking much of like a lot of my time, but sure you can have like another question. Yeah. If both sides have no questions, do you think it's okay to ask how's your day? Um, that's a great question. I would recommend against it, if especially if you don't have a question, you should probably find one, even if it doesn't make sense. Asking how's your day to a tech judge, that's most likely gonna look pretty bad. Like you're like you like don't care, you're not taking it seriously. Um, I mean, you should probably be doing those things before the round as well. Yeah, but I would generally avoid keep it like centered on the debate because those are like really awkward non-debate related questions. And if you guys really don't have any questions, you guys can like agree to end cross early maybe if you guys come to a consensus on that. If you're or you can just like sit it out in silence, or the best option is you come up with a question and you ask it. But yeah, in general, I would advise against this. I've never seen anybody do it before. Um, but I would advise against this. Yeah, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions? All right. So I guess it's been quite a long time. Yeah, it's been an hour. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I hope you guys find this presentation helpful and yeah, hope you all have a good day.